What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Final Fantasy XVI, specifically its PC release, which just happened relatively recently, which, as a PC-focused channel, was important to me at least, as it was my chance to finally play this one for myself, as I've played all of the Final Fantasies, or at least the mainline titles, I should say. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked in the description below that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of this game in particular, as this did come to PC recently, I did not get a review key for it. I did in fact pay for this one, and as 100% go, that's usually a pretty easy situation because everything has a guide associated with it already, so it's very easy to just look up information about this stuff, even if that process can be a little bit time-consuming. Now, with that stuff said, I would say the main thing I knew about Final Fantasy XVI before starting this is that it was a relatively polarizing game, and that is because this one steps into a more action RPG role rather than, I would say, the traditional party-based JRPG of the other Final Fantasies. And like any time you see a genre shift within an established franchise, you're going to have some pushback on that. Change is never universally liked, as I like to say. And while I broadly had fun with this one, even despite that genre change, I do think there are some weak parts of this game in particular. For instance, there's a whole gear and progression system associated with upgrading that gear, but that is such a linear bit of progression that it ultimately feels kind of meaningless, as a brief example. But luckily, I would say that trademark Final Fantasy over-the-top spectacle does manage to pull you in for the most part, especially right at the beginning, and outside of some bloat, I think it makes for a great experience overall. Even if it probably could have used someone coming in and kind of trimming the fat, so to speak. But from there, let's talk about the technical state of this one. As this is a relatively recent release over on PC, how is it running? Well, for me, it ran really well, actually. It occasionally had a few stutters, but that was really about it. Other than that, I didn't personally have much issue at all. However, as a quick browse through Steam reviews would tell you, that is hardly the case for everyone. In fact, many people are having a lot of issues with it, as some people are reporting all sorts of issues with crashes, frame rate problems, just to name a few, so definitely something to be aware of. I didn't, again, personally experience any of that, but you certainly run that risk over here on PC. Now, outside of simply how it's running, I will say other parts of this port are really quite good, such as the ability to fully rebind keys, which on keyboard and mouse for an action-oriented game is incredibly important. I'm well aware some people would prefer to use a controller, and as of recently I actually own a few, but I am much more comfortable with keyboard and mouse, so it is my preference, and I think if you're bringing a game to PC, the default control scheme there, keyboard and mouse, should be up to snuff, and it is here, which I appreciated. Though I don't believe it has proper support for ultra-wide monitors, is really about the only other thing that I noticed, and I believe the cutscenes for the game are still at 30 FPS, but honestly that's just not something I really care about personally, but it might bother you, so here it is as a mention. Moving on a little bit though, let's then talk difficulty. So when you first fire up the game, you're going to have access to two difficulties, story mode or action mode basically, or easy and normal. Pretty much what it says on the tin. On story mode, enemies are easier to kill, they take more damage, have less health, etc., etc. Action focused is more about the combat and thus is a little more difficult and is the default way to play. Now, once you finish the game, you'll get access to what is called Final Fantasy mode in New Game Plus. This is a much harder difficulty that cannot be changed after the fact. It does things like increase the level cap and accounts for all your accumulated skill from the previous run through the game. However, what I will say is that it does not seem to take into account having done the DLC in the base game first, and so if you've done the DLC and then start that mode, you'll actually be at a much higher starting point than you would be otherwise. And then just as a little aside, you can actually also jump past the tutorial of the game, which is fairly lengthy, in order to start this mode on New Game Plus, which I just thought was a nice little touch. Actually, still not all when it comes to difficulty mode though, because in Final Fantasy mode, you get another difficulty option in the game's arcade mode. Now, the arcade mode is always available. Basically, there's a stone at your main hub area that you can go back to replay certain story missions or certain boss fights in a more like score-oriented situation. And in Final Fantasy mode, those also have an extra difficulty that you can play around with called Ultimaniac. It's only available there, so that's certainly something something to know. Now, also right in this section, mostly because I didn't know where else to throw it in this particular review, after you beat both the game and its DLC content, you gain access to, in that particular save file, what they call the Kairos Gate. This is effectively like a little mini roguelite of combat challenges that you can go through, and as you go through them, you'll earn certain points that allow you to pick up permanent or temporary upgrades for this mode in order to help you clear it out. So there is that. Now, moving right along though, let's talk about the story setup for this one. So, right away, I don't want to spoil this game for anybody, especially because it just came to PC, and if you're like me, you've been waiting for that and avoiding basically anything about the game until recently, and thus I would hate to be the one to spoil that for people. So I want to talk about the basic setup for the game, and that's going to be just about it, outside of maybe some general thoughts. With that in mind, though, I am going to talk about some things like progression system-wise that are inherently also minor spoilers. Because to explain one of the progression systems, you essentially have to know something that happens multiple times throughout the story that aids in that progression, so certainly something to be aware of. Now, with that little disclaimer out of the way, to get fully into it, Final Fantasy XVI follows the story of Clive Rossfield and his family, who are effectively the ruling line of the Grand Duchy of Rosaria. And naturally, all of the politics associated with that, including the multiple other nations surrounding them, who are all vying for control of things like dominance, bearers, and the mother crystals, which are at the heart of everything here. Now, a dominant is a person who has control of what they call an icon, or effectively like a summon, except this time the dominant turns into that summon and can wreak untold havoc in that form. Because of this power, they're largely used as weapons of war, with each individual nation having differing methods of how they approach them. For instance, the Ironbloods think they're a blasphemous creation that is only useful as a weapon of war, and they are treated very poorly. Whereas the dominant of the Phoenix of the Grand Duchy of Rosaria is typically the leader of that area, and is treated with the utmost respect. Now, in a somewhat similar but slightly different situation, we have bearers. Bearers are effectively people who can use magic. They are branded immediately after their discovery, which is that black mark on their face and neck, and after this they are effectively treated as slaves, not even really considered human by most places, but again, their treatment does vary nation to nation. Now, you would think, with their ability to channel magic, that they would rise up and defend themselves, but the reason this doesn't happen so much is that the more and more that they use their powers, it actually kills them at the same time, slowly petrifying them and turning them to stone in what is called the curse, which is also something that can happen to dominants but seems to take longer. Which are some basic things you need to know about this setup as a whole, but more specifically, we play as Clive Rossfield, and in the early section of the game, the tutorial area, we first see Clive as an Imperial bearer, effectively a slave being used for war, largely as expendable tools. In a quick flashback, however, we get Clive's backstory. Clive is actually an heir to the throne of the Grand Duchy of Rosaria, which recently fell to imperial vassalation from the Holy Empire of Sanbreque, who, with the aid of the current ruler, your character's father's wife, managed to perform some treachery to effectively overthrow the duchy, which is what leads to your younger brother Joshua's death in his phoenix form at the hands of Ifrit, another dominant of fire, or icon of fire, which is unusual because typically there's only one icon per element. So a lot of mysteries going on there, but the long and short of it is that your character, Clive, 13 years since, after being abandoned by his mother who helped the Imperials, for the simple sake that you weren't Joshua and thus the dominant for which you were always scorned, your prize is effectively slavery in the hands of the Empire until such an opportunity presents itself that you're managed to break free of this, specifically a chance meeting with a childhood friend that sets you on the path of resistance, and the story only gets more grand and interesting from there, but that is everything I want to say about it right now, because anything else would be some pretty hard spoilers. Though, much more generally, to give some of my own thoughts on it, I think the intro to the game is very strong. Like, all this setup and everything, it's a little heavy on the cinematics, but I think the story is interesting enough that it's very compelling. I also think this story ultimately wraps up with a really beautiful ending that is open to interpretation. There's a couple events that, depending on your view of them, are really left up to how you feel about what happened. All along the middle portion there are some great moments and some that frankly drag on a little too long, harkening back to some of that bloat that I mentioned. Now, there's a ton of moments that are spectacular fights against other icons and stuff that are genuinely a spectacle to behold. There's also a lot of moments of the story where they simply block your progression by forcing you to find your way around a gate or a passage in some way, which ultimately turns out to be a bunch of different side quests in order for you to clear the obstacle. This happens multiple times and it gets a little annoying by the end of the game, and there's a lot of that type of content I think they could have cut just to make this a tighter experience that doesn't drag on so much. Which is especially important as we're about to start talking about progression systems in combat, which, while I enjoyed those systems for what they were, simply aren't enough in terms of depth and complexity to really warrant the length of the game. So let's talk about some of those progression systems. They're pretty basic. It's essentially your gear, your ability points, your level, and some general other upgrades. Now, at a very basic level, like many RPGs, you gain experience as you win fights and clear quests. This will level you up. Your stats go up as you level up. It's all passive. You don't really have any control over that. They all seem to go up by set amounts every level. The higher your level, the stronger you are by default. Then we have our gear. This is your weapon and 2 armor items, as well as several different accessories. Your accessories you have some options with. They each do different things. They can let you strengthen individual skills or just more generic stats. In the DLCs, you even get some more interesting ones that have other effects. But for your weapon and your defensive items, these are extremely linear. There is a very clear progression, and each tier is better than the previous one. And as you clear fights and everything, you're going to earn all sorts of crafting materials, and as long as you don't sell those, you're always going to have the material for the next best bit of gear. So it's very easy to keep up to date on that, and it's kind of a boring item system, frankly. But then we have our ability points. As we complete quests and win fights, we're also going to be earning ability points. We spend these on upgrading our own iconic powers. Initially, Clive here has been blessed by his brother, the Phoenix, with some of that power known as the Blessing of the Phoenix, which allows you to use certain magical abilities. As the game progresses, we're going to pick up more of these different iconic blessings, so to speak, that give you access to different kinds of magic and different abilities. As you gain those, you can upgrade them, making those abilities more powerful, and potentially even allowing them to be equipped into the slots of different icons. Now, you can reset this at any time. You can just go to that menu and hold a button to completely reset it, which actually kind of mitigates its usefulness, because while there are some general upgrades to your basic combat abilities you're going to always want, you can otherwise simply max out the iconic powers you are using all the time, and then, reset and reevaluate anytime you want to change. So it's very easy to always have the highest level of upgrades for the skills you are actually using, rendering a lot of this system kind of pointless. Now, if you want to go avoid some of the hassle of setting these up, in the loadout screen, you can actually set up to 5 different combinations of your different ones, as at a max, you can have up to 3 of these blessings active at any time that allows you to hot swap between them in combat, switching the elements of your magic and allowing you to use that one's abilities and swap them out and mess around with how they interact. And you can have up to 5 of those loadout setup that you can quickly hot swap between. Outside of just those things, there are a couple of other tiny progression systems, like some side quests to get access to a chocobo to allow you to move around faster, and upgrading the amount of potions you can carry with you at any time, for instance. But that is pretty much it as far as progression goes, which brings us to the gameplay and world section. So first, I want to talk about how this game is structured in terms of main story missions and everything, and then we'll talk a little more about lore and whatnot. So from a structural standpoint, the game can largely be divided up into the main story and everything else, both structurally as well as narratively. Now, structurally, what I mean here is that the main quest often sends you to handle a few objectives in the open world section, so to speak, before coming up on a section of the game that is actually a more linear mission-based dungeon, followed by a big battle with whatever boss lies at the end of that chapter. Both those missions and those boss fights are what you're going to be able to go back to that stone in your hideout for to replay in a more score-oriented manner via arcade mode. Now, outside of those missions during the open world, you'll get access to your main hub area, which is where you'll go do all your crafting, some basic shopping, pick up side quests, look for any potential hunts, etc. And from here, you can travel to one of the game's large regions, which can largely be divided up into the different countries the game has to offer, each one of which is effectively a large explorable area with its own secrets, side quests, trials, etc. Now, what you can get up to in each of those areas is basically side quests and hunts, as well as, of course, just general exploration. Now, the side quests are a mixed bag, frankly. I think some of them are great and expand knowledge about certain topics that relate to the main story, like how bearers are treated in each individual nation, and some of them even follow up on settlements across the course of the game to see how things progress and change the whole time, and it's interesting to see a lot of that stuff in motion. Other side quests, however, are extremely basic fetch quests that do and accomplish very little, and could have been cut entirely with absolutely zero impact on anything this game is trying to do because those quests are pointless. Now, unfortunately for you, there's not a lot of great ways to tell between those two different things, which can make many of the side quests feel tedious at best, especially because a lot of them involve very long, drawn-out conversations that, unlike their main story counterparts, which also have a lot of long, drawn-out cutscenes and things of that nature, are simply done via characters close-up, camera frame-wise, just kind of flapping their gums at you in a way that doesn't line up with the words on screen even, which makes a lot of them feel like busy work with the most generous of interpretations. So like I said, bit of a mixed bag. Another thing you can do are the hunts. Hunts are effectively little mini boss battles for enemies you can track down and destroy for rewards, crafting materials, money, etc. Most of these are pretty straightforward. A couple of them have some interesting mechanics, but for the most part, as long as you are the appropriate level, these will not be difficult. And unlike other games where you had to perform special actions to get these guys to appear, in these cases you literally just go show up and they will be where the game hints that they are, that you can find out from the hunt board at your hideaway. So not bad, not great. This means that the more open sections of the game see you either exploring some landscapes, which can be fun, finding some treasures, fighting enemies as you go, doing some side quests, which may or may not add meaningful content to the game, or simply fighting little mini-boss battles, probably against a special variant of one of the game's relatively few enemy types. Now, that's not a bad system per se, but I have to say it just doesn't hit quite the same when you are effectively a single person who, even if you have other characters with you, won't add much to the conversation when you're doing all this, and that action RPG focus juxtaposed against content that is more typically tailored towards party-based JRPGs feels a little bit at odds with each other. Now, while that's how a lot of this stuff works functionally, there's also, the actual world they've built here, the warring nations, the politics of it. That part, I think, is really interesting. When I was having the most fun learning and exploring this world, it was mostly doing those more impactful side quests where you're learning about the plight of the bearers, how they're treated by individual places, what your character is doing about it, and the steps you're taking to help the settlements you meet, no matter the nation that they're in, a lot of which has to do with fighting the Blight. The Blight doesn't come up a ton during the main story, it's more of just a general background threat, but in a lot of the side content and exploration in particular, it plays a more prevalent role. Because the Blight is this force that's kind of just sucking the land dry of ether, or magic, and the ability for the land to thrive and provide life to everything. The Blight, effectively ruining large swaths of land, making them uninhabitable, is what is leading to a lot of this political drama and why these nations are at each other's throats to begin with. Now, in order to stave off the Blight, most people are turning to what they call the Mother Crystals, these gigantic crystals that provide people with magic even if they are not bearers, which are used in everyday life to provide all sorts of resources and generally enhance people's lives. But the thing about Mother Crystals is that they can also lead to what is called an ether flood. This is is effectively where the land gets overfilled with ether and starts turning enemies and things into monsters, and across the game you'll have to help settlements deal with that and the ramifications of story events on these settlements and stuff. And I think a lot of the evaluation of those things and the effects that these story events are having on the rest of the world are pretty compelling, and I like that a lot. And it does help make up for, at least, the side quests that can often be more annoying than fun. Which brings us to the combat side of things. So, combat in a game like this, effectively an action RPG, is naturally a huge deal. And for the most part, I think that combat system is pretty good, but there's just not enough of it, system and depth-wise, to really justify how long this game is, especially if you're trying to do everything. A little bit might be on me for trying for the 100%, but still. So combat is divided up into your basic moveset, your iconic abilities, how those interact, as well as some general enemy mechanics like the stagger bar, and limit breaks. Now your character has a host of just general moves. If you hit an enemy 4 times, that constitutes a combo. There are some other moves you can use, like holding down R to close the distance on an enemy by charging at them more or less. Shooting magic out of your offhand, charging those up, charging up your melee strikes with magic, attacking an enemy, only to follow that up with a magical attack, just to name a few potential options. But then there are your iconic abilities. As I mentioned, you can have up to 3 of these equipped on your current loadout at any given time. You can intermingle these, swapping between them on the fly to not exactly combo them, but follow them up in interesting ways. Like, for instance, some of these can launch enemies into midair, some of them can be casted from midair. Depending on your abilities and what you have upgraded, some of them can actually be assigned to other icons that they would not typically be associated with. So, for instance, you'll be able to use one icon's abilities even though you have a separate iconic power equipped to you, which can be a little fun to interact with. And then each of these iconic powers has a special ability. For the basic one, this is simply covering the distance by sort of mini teleporting to them. The lightning one lets you sort of mark and discharge lightning at enemies that can then be triggered to explode. Some of them are more defensive in nature, simply being just like a straight up block, for instance. So there's a lot of those that, because you get ultimately 3 of them, you can use interchangeably and find fun combos that makes up the core of the combat system, and depending on how much you're willing to experiment there will likely determine how much fun you wind up having with that until you find a combination that you really like. But let's talk about a few other mechanics. So enemies can be divided up into small and large. Large enemies have a stagger bar. As you deplete it, you'll be able to stagger them, opening them up to extra damage from you. And depending on your setup of abilities, sometimes it can be really easy to stagger an enemy very, very quickly, keeping them effectively stun locked and unable to attack you back. And when that meter drops by 50%, they actually get briefly stunned, allowing you an opening to cast more large wind-up abilities that take a second to actually pull off, which is something to know. And then a little later on, as the story progresses, you eventually get access to a limit break option via a secondary energy bar that when it's full, you can activate your limit break, which gives you the ability to shrug off attacks without being sort of momentarily stunned yourself, but also allows you to heal and regenerate health as you're taking hits, which is normally going to require you to utilize potions, which you have a limited number of. And when you put all of that together, I think you have a fun and engaging combat system that ultimately just can't quite stand up to how long this game winds up being, and would likely be better suited to something just shorter, frankly. Especially when you throw in those problems with progressions where you'll be changing things like weapons and whatnot pretty frequently, but really all that does is make numbers go up because it's a very linear system that does very little otherwise. And then with abilities where you can just freely respec those at any time, you're basically always going to have the abilities you actually use maxed out, rendering that system largely pointless as well. So while it is a fun system, I do think it's stretched a little too thin over the bones of this game. Next up, however, I would like to talk about DLC before we start wrapping this one up. So there are 2 DLCs that came out for this game, which are available on PC as well via the Complete Edition, and they are Echoes of the Fallen as well as Rising Tide. Rising Tide is the bigger one. Echoes of the Fallen is a shorter story about some magic crystals that have begun popping up that you can then go investigate, which leads to a dungeon as well as a big boss fight at the end. You're going to get some fantastic fantastic equipment from this, including a really, really good sword. But the equipment you're going to get here is equipment that actually has different effects and whatnot, which makes it a little more interesting than the base games. And it's also recommended you do this one first because you're going to meet a character that then later shows back up in the Rising Tide for an extra quest there as well. Now, the Rising Tide is all about finding out what happened to Leviathan the Lost, which gets a couple of mentions during the main game about being an icon that is missing. No one knows what happened to it. And over the course of the Rising Tide, you will get to the bottom of that mystery while also engaging in some harder boss fights as well. However, this time around, there's much more side content and exploration to be had because it is more than just effectively a single dungeon. This one feels more like an expansion, and it also adds, I believe, the Kairos Gate and a couple other things if you've completed all of the other content of the game, such as a final quest at the end of it. Now, both of these DLCs have some items and whatnot that you'll be able to use right away at the beginning of the game. However, they themselves, the actual content of it, is not available until effectively right before the end of the game. And after you beat the game, if you did that first, you will be able to load a previous save and go back and do them as well. So there's no real need to do them in any particular order. So that's largely up to you. Overall, though, pretty solid DLCs. A lot of the boss fights involved were very interesting to mess around with, and I generally had fun with them. Moving right along, though, we then have the Steam Deck section. The Steam Deck for this one is sadly a no-go. The official rating is unsupported, and that is because it is all but impossible to get a decent frame rate with this thing, which is especially important in an action game like this. So simply put, while you can technically get this game to run, it runs very, very poorly on the Steam Deck. So let's talk positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, I was a big fan of the story, the characters, the just honestly huge spectacle of a lot of it. And while there's certainly some bloat involved in that, I think a lot of it is good enough to justify everything it's got going on, including some lengthy cutscenes at times. I also enjoyed its slightly more mature tilt, as a lot of Final Fantasies don't tend to move quite as heavy into that type of thing, and while I wouldn't say it's egregious here or anything, it was appreciated. I also think a lot of the core systems, if a little bit simple at times, are fun. And the feedback from them is good, and truth be told, I think if I hadn't 100% this one, I probably would have enjoyed them a little more than I did, because they wouldn't have went on for quite as long as was necessary to 100% this game, which is certainly something to know. Now, on the negative side of things, it's a few different things. It's a lot of systems that don't quite mesh with this blending of genres. For instance, a lot of what they're trying to do is mix, I would say, a more traditional party-based JRPG with elements of a proper action RPG, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Like being able to customize gear and load out Clive here in many different ways is largely pointless in a lot of cases because those systems are not in-depth enough to matter, and it's mostly just making numbers go up as high as possible. And having a progression system that I can freely respec at literally any time, outside of combat at least, also doesn't really feel great in terms of sort of picking a playstyle or a build and going with it. Whereas something more party-based would have loadouts for individual characters with specialized roles and equipment that could change how they play a little bit and be much more interesting, like we've seen in past Final Fantasy titles. So as far as negatives go, I would simply say that the biggest one by far is that this blending of genres and this little experiment that they've done here just doesn't always work out and at times can feel a little awkward, especially in the main story sections where you're just blasting through what are very obviously corridors, followed by a boss fight in a very linear fashion, and it doesn't really feel like you're engaging with anything outside of the combat system because it's an action RPG, which is juxtaposed against what they're trying to do everywhere else. Then you have things like the actual side content in that everything else that are frankly very dull and uninteresting, which all combines to make me feel like Final Fantasy XVI would have benefited from a bit more focus, frankly. It just feels like there's a lot of bloat here, and at times that they just didn't really know what they wanted to do or what direction they wanted to take, so they were trying to blend a lot of this stuff together, which feels awkward in some places. And that brings me to my conclusion for this one. Final Fantasy XVI, just by the very nature of changing up the genre a bit, was always going to be a controversial game. Anytime you have an established franchise that makes a big change like that, it's a huge deal. every single time. Some people are good with it. I don't personally mind. As an example, other people are going to hate that because they have a skewed expectation going into it about what that franchise is that you fundamentally changed. And now, having played it for myself, I can say I understand that polarizing take on it even more, because if you go into this game expecting a party-based JRPG, there's very little of that to be had here, even if they try to fit in some of the core mechanics of it, like the exploration and side questing, etc. from those games, which here feels very awkward when you put that up against the more action RPG-oriented systems, and to those people, I bet this game does feel terrible. However, if you go into it expecting an action RPG with some decent side content, then I think you're likely to have a great time with it, given that I do think the story is pretty solid, and even quite moving in quite a few different parts, especially the beginning and the endings. So when it comes to an official recommendation for Final Fantasy XVI, I would say it comes down to this. The base game is $50, the complete edition with the DLC is $70 US, and of course whatever that is regionally for you. But luckily there is a demo available over on Steam where you can play this for yourself and get an idea of how the game feels. This is the introductory chapter to the game, which will show you all the basics of how everything works, and then there's also a challenge mode where you can play fully with the combat system, which I think should give people a really good idea about whether or not they enjoy the changes that this game has made to the Final Fantasy formula, because if you're good with that, then I think the game absolutely justifies its price tag. Having paid for it myself, I say that with full confidence. But if you go into this game expecting a fully party-based JRPG like all of its predecessors, or at least most of them, then I think you're going to be disappointed, because while they try to incorporate elements of it, that just isn't what this game is. Otherwise, it's a great game with a few annoyances to be sure, a few minor quibbles, but mostly pretty great. And that, I think, is where I'm going to finally wrap up this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, learned a few things, found it informative, or simply wanted to hear my opinion, I suppose. In any event, I'd love to know what you think about this one down in the comment section below, so do be sure to tell me, as I need you to feed the flames of the algorithm by liking, commenting, and subscribing. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.